if there's probably two major things that make a difference between a good fly and a bad fly, they are this: is the manner in which the hackle is wound, and the other being the wing set, particularly on wing wet flies. But we'll deal with that a little later on. But let me just run through a few little elements as far as hackles are concerned. The important thing, of course, is that you use a hackle that's got some related size by proportionate value to the hook size of the fly that you're tying, or at least it should have some relationship to that. That's not absolutely totally true, and I'll explain that a little later on when we go through some tying technique. But bear that one in mind, and that does take a little experience, to select exactly the hackle size you need for the particular fly that you're tying in hand. Also bear in mind too that some hackles don't lend themselves to what we call significant wind factors. In other words, you maybe get 1 or maybe 1.5 turns and that's it, you're done, because they're very small. On the other hand, if you take like a partridge hackle or a grouse hackle or some of the others, you've got a lot of wind. But bear in mind this factor also, that if you take a hackle, it doesn't really matter from which species of bird it is, it's going to have a variable in so far as the width of the actual fiber from the stem. And one hackle may serve for a purpose for 3 different sizes of hooks, because essentially what you're going to do is this. If you're going to tie, for example, this particular hackle I've chosen here for a small fly, it's really only the extremity of the tip section that you're actually going to use. And of course they are the shorter fibers. As you move up the stem of the hackle, then they gradually increase in length. So that's going to give you another option, say for size, whatever it is, 14s and 16s. And when you come to the base end of the hackle, then you're going to get larger width of hackle, and that's going to suit you more, say, for size 12s and size 14s. So each hackle generally gives you an option of, shall we say, hook sizes that you can use that particular hackle for. The exception largely to the rule is when you're using these very, very small hackles like this from these typically, game birds or wader birds and birds of that kind of nature. You're pretty much restricted totally to the choice of hackle for the hook size you're using, because you have a minimum amount of turns that hackle will allow you to use at any one point in time. Okay, we'll move on, and I'm going to show you essentially the 4 main methods of hackling wet flies, spider flies or soft hackles. And it really is just a technique of tying more than anything else, and the process of wind of that hackle. And I'll explain a little bit more when we get into actually demonstrating those techniques. There's essentially 2 ways to, shall we say, make what I call a full wound hackle at the head of the fly. And that can only be did by 2 methods. One is you tie the hackle in first by the stem, and or you tie the hackle in by the tip. And typically many, many years ago, hackles were tied in by the stems, and there were reasons for that, and that very much related to the understanding of techniques as far as tying was concerned. Frequently they would tie the flies in their hands, but more to the point, in some cases where a small hackle was concerned, it was a lot easier to do it that way, because it's very, very difficult to tie a very small hackle unless you're really good at doing it by the tip. So what I'm first going to demonstrate to you is the process of tying the hackle in by the stem. There's another advantage to doing that too. Typically today you see most soft hackles tied with fairly heavy hackle with a fairly serious inclination rearward of those fibers. If you look historically at what we term in the UK as the North Country spider flies, they tended to have a hackle which was more, shall we say, at a relative angle out to the hook as opposed to enclosed like this. And there's a specific way that you go about to tying that hackle so that it does that. In other words, it exhibits more of that outward sparse spidery effect as opposed to that heavier rearward inclination effect, which is kind of typical of soft hackles as they're tied today, which there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a difference insofar as the fly is concerned at the end of the day when you tie those specific flies. So if you want really sparse flies, in other words sparse bodied flies with maybe thread bodies, maybe very sparse dubbing on them, maybe a little bit of material tied in the thoracic region before the hackle, this is the way to do it. Next thing, a good way to learn a wind hackle is just essentially learn a wind hackle. Forget about tying the fly. It doesn't make any difference what you did, whether you tied a tail, a body, whatever. At the end of the day, the hackle wind remains the same, regardless of whether it's done on a hook with no body or one with. So learn to perfect hackle winds just on a bare hook, and then you won't have to throw away flies that you screwed up at the end of it. Okay. Attach a thread base. That's the first thing. And this is for demonstration purposes, bear in mind too. We're not actually tying a specific fly from start to beginning at this point in time, but we'll do that a little later. Okay, let's just take one of these partridge hackles. Bear in mind too that the brown hackles you generally find down the back of the bird. Another thing too about hackle quality, you know, I'm really fussy about that. You know, when I look at that hackle, I want to make sure that there's no destruction of that fiber. I want a really kind of perfect edge to those, no bits and pieces missing. And I have to say, you know, that's not always easy to find too much in partridge hackle today for one reason or the other. But all I will urge you to do is when you go to your fly shop and you look for them, just check that out. Make sure that you've got perfect definition of fiber and you don't have these little pieces that are kind of eaten away by mites or whatever else have got in there. Okay. This is what we define as more a butt section wind. What you're going to do is you're going to take the hackle like this and you're going to tear down from it all the base worthless fiber that you don't need. And it's very important that you keep clean stem there. Absolutely, very important. And typically I watch a lot of guys tying flies and they just don't tear that back far enough. You don't need to rip that off, it serves no purpose at this point of time. Just keep that like that. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to hold the hackle so the face side of the hackle faces you. In other words, if you're looking at that bird skin, that face side of the hackle which you see looking at you is the same side of the hackle that you need to face you when you tie that hackle in. And we're going to do that right now. We're just going to take a very gentle pinch and loop like that, and we're going to incorporate the stem of the hackle, and we just build a little thread body there. When we got down there we can pretty much disregard that and get that out of the way. Okay, now we got our hackle ready in a position to wind. Hackle plies, really important. A lot of hackle plies out there, I will tell you, don't really serve the purpose for usefulness as far as winding soft hackles are concerned. Many of these hackles are really delicate, and if you're using big, heavy, obtrusive hackle plies, typically they'll snap those hackles on you. Furthermore, they're so big they're not easy to maneuver, and you cannot beat these little small hackle plies for doing that. They've got very small margin on the jaws. They hold a hackle generally pretty firmly, and they're easy to work with when you manipulate the hackle around the hook to affect the wind. Okay, now grip the hackle always centerwise in the stem because that's the strongest part. And so far as this is concerned, as we reverse the hackle and bring it around, we just make sure that the hackle turn. You can clearly see as I wind around the hook, the fibers of that hackle are standing out at right angle to the shank of the hook. Okay, now what's the easiest and quickest way to secure the hackle without getting yourself kind of messed up left, right, and this, that, and the other? This is absolutely the easiest way. Hold the hackle stem up, take the thread up. As long as you take the thread up and over and you maintain that tension, the hackle will not undo itself, and then just bring your bobbin back round. Now you've secured the hackle with that one turn. Make a second and a third to add the security. Bring up the waste fiber of hackle, cut that out, and you can clearly see that you've effected what we call a spider hackle effect. In other words, the fibers stand well away at right angles to the hook shank, and then you would of course finish off the head of the fly. So that's typically what you would incorporate so far as wind is concerned for what we call a typical spider hackle fly, which are generally very sparse, typical North Country style flies. The second method of shall we say, producing a full wound hackle is you tie it in by the tip. And that's a technique I use a great deal, and again I emphasize that it does somewhat relate to the fly that you're tying. But anyway, the technique and process is this. We have tied the body of the fly, and the hackle would go in prior to the wing if we were going to wing the fly. And of course we would have our thread base already set there and we'd be in the bobbin hang position. Okay, we use hand hackle for this. It doesn't really matter whether I use partridge or anything else. Same thing, prep the hackle in the right and proper way. Pull down the fiber that you're not going to use anyway. Even though you may not wind the hackle to the full extent, it doesn't matter. Get it clear and out of your way. Okay? Hackle is prepped. Now watch very carefully what I'm going to explain to you. If you have the ability to grasp it with your fingers, that's fine. If you don't, then use these little fine point hackle pliers like that, and very, very gently just stroke those fibers into a rearward inclination. Now some hackle will literally stay there. It doesn't tend to spring back. Other hackle may well do that. So typically what you need to do is this. First and foremost, you need to assess what width of hackle you need in relation to the size of the hook you're doing or tying. And there's kind of a way that you can easily do that. If you hold the hackle stem just behind the eye, and you then assess the distance or length of hackle fiber from the stem rearward to the hook, if you've got that somewhere in the region of just about the same length overall the hook or just a shade more, when you wound that hackle, you're going to get a good proportionate value. If you're kind of up here where, you know, we can see that's real short, and if, for example, this was like twice the length, where, you know, that's too long. So as a general guide, I'm not saying it has to be an exact one, but if you pretty much work on the basis where the hackle stem is, just behind the eye of the hook, and how far the hackle fiber itself extends, if it's somewhere around about the bend of the hook or a little more, you're pretty much about right. Bear in mind also what I explained a little earlier on, is where you actually tie the hackle in, again, it's a relative factor to the size of the hook related to the actual size or width of the barbs left side and right side of the center quill. Okay, so we're going to go somewhere in a region around about there, because we know after we assess the distance that that's approximately about right. And what we're going to do is this. And watch very, very carefully what I do. First and foremost, I grip the hackle firmly, and I never loose it go. I do it with my thumb and my second finger, not my thumb and my first finger. My thumb and my second finger. And keep them back as far as you can from that little point right there. What I'm then going to do is get my scissors, and I'm going to cut a real neat little section that creates a little minute V. And that is going to be offered up underneath the shank of the hook, so it touches the shank of the hook, right side of the thread. And whilst you maintain that position, just take the thread over the top and secure it with one turn, making sure that, again, the face side of the hackle that you see on the skin of the bird or the wing, whichever it is, faces you. You've made one turn to secure it in the correct position. You've made a second turn to add security, and you made a third turn to lock it. Now, there's a lot of strength there insofar as how that hackle is held in by that small amount of thread. It's a tension related issue. That's simply what it is. But also notice how everything is clean. I've got no excess hackle to cut off. If I went through the process that typically a lot of people also do, which is this, they grab the hackle and they tie all this in, well, you know what, you've got to cut that off anyway, and you can't tie it in with thread in the first place anyway, so you may as well get it out of the way and not have to worry about it. If I have the ability to manipulate a hackle with my hands as opposed to use the hackle pliers, I will do it every time. I know some people have a little trouble to do that, and that's fine. If you need to use the hackle pliers, that's okay. But typically, you know, if you prep the hackle like this, and you leave enough of the base fiber, which is of no use in the first place there, you got something to grip. Now this is important. Watch real careful what I'm going to do at this point of time. I'm holding the hackle up, and I'm very gently using my left thumb and second finger to pull those fibers back into a rearward inclination. Stage 1. Stage 2. Under a degree of tension, bring the hackle around the hook shank back towards you. Once you've got it maintained in that position, you can release your grip from your left hand, transfer it to the left, pick up again with the right, raise the hackle up, repeat the same process. Back round, each turn coming in front of the other. Often as not, I may just use my finger like this just to stop the hackle twisting back on itself. Come back up again, and basically it's a repetitive process. If you only wish to wind a sparse hackle, take 1.5 turns. If you want a heavier hackle wind, then continue with the turns. But it's a very simple process. Okay, how do we secure the hackle? Same as previous. Hold the hackle stem up, take the thread up, as long as you maintain tension on your thread at all times. 1, 2, 3, that's all that's needed. The hackle's secured. Bring the blade of the scissor back behind the hackle stem, and you've got a perfectly wound hackle in what I call an extreme rearward inclination of wind. I will tell you now that if you have to use thread and back that over that hackle to force those fibers back, you didn't wind it right in the first place. And of course you're inevitably building up thread bulk to do that. So at all times trying to finish with what I call a clean wind. In other words, you don't have to take thread back to force rearward inclination of the fiber, and neither do you have a bunch of stuff all over the place that you've got to try and cut out and clear out of the way. As you noticed, I used 3 wraps of thread there to finish the wind of the head, and I would just use simply 1, 2, 3 more wraps to finish the head off the fly, which produces a very, very neat head to the fly. Each type of hackle you wind is different. I mean, this particular hackle that I used here was a very, very soft fiber. If I used one which was a little stiffer, and shall we say the relationship of how the curvature of the hackle is naturally, this is fairly flat. Each hackle differs somewhat, so you're going to get some variance in the wind. But nevertheless, the technique of tying is exactly the same. What I'm looking for is perfect symmetrical balance of the hackle wind to the hook. And as you can see, the tips of the hackle just about there at the end of the bend of the hook. That's exactly what you're looking for. Also, bear in mind too, if you're going to wing this fly, and we'll deal with that a little later, if you don't make a good, what we call mount at that particular point for the wing to set, you ain't never going to set a good wing. You create too much unnecessary bulk here. Pretty much I can run my finger across the top there, and you see how flat that is? No unnecessary bulk. That means to say when the wing is set, it's not being pushed up against thread bulk or hackle bulk. It's going to sit like that. The next hackle technique is, we call that a palmered hackle. They can be a full palmered hackle or part ways. In other words, what I'm saying is that the hackle is actually wound from the head of the fly back to the tail end. But that in some patterns you don't necessarily wind it the entire way. In some cases, like with flimps or something of that nature, you may actually tie that hackle in about 1/3 ways down, and then once the body of the fly is made, then that's wound back up towards the head. But to all intents and purposes, what I'm discussing here is a palmered hackle, which is typically used for the traditional style bob flies, i.e. the flies that you fish on the top dropper. And the fact there's more hackle there enables you to work that fly and so it dances just on and off the surface, mimicking caddis and terrestrials and various other flies. The fact of the matter is, if you work a bob fly the right way, absolutely deadly for brown trout. They just can't resist seeing that, and boom, up they come. Now, in the case of this hackle preparation, little different from what we previously did with the wound hackle. Typically what you're going to do is this: you're going to select the hackle of the right size, and ideally what you want is a hackle, if you can find it, that's got the width of the fiber from thick to thin. In other words, kind of like an arrow shape like this. So as you wind at the head end, you get the wider part, and as you taper down to the body, it reduces. So you get that kind of nice definitive shape. If you can't find hackles like that, don't worry about it. You know, I don't think it's too important, but it does add a little value to the, shall we say, the proportionate value of the fly. In the case of this particular hackle, go back here, what we're going to do is we're going to strip off all of the waste fiber like this. Each side, one side, two sides, this side. And you can go about further in your tying process by a couple of different ways. If you're dealing with hackle that's got thick stem, you know what, just get your fingernail like that and just make a little crimp there, just like that. And what that does, it kind of flattens the stem and reduces the amount of bulk. And that hackle is always tied in underneath, just like that, underneath to the shank of the hook, touched to the right side of the thread, one thread wrap over the top to make sure you've got it secured in position. Never ever tie the hackle in on top of the shank of the hook, always below. And I'll explain to you the reason why. Let me just make a couple more security turns here. If you tie the hackle on top of the shank of the hook, as you start to wind it, you're going to bend that hackle back over itself like that to proceed to wind. Also, it's more beneficial to wind a hackle away from you than it is towards you, and particularly in the case of a palmered hackle. It's very, very difficult. It's easy to maintain what I call relative tension of wind during the process of wind, and also regulate that you've got equal distancing of the turns of that hackle as you go down. Anyways, just make sure you've got that firmly secure, and if you're happy about that, that's fine. You don't necessarily have to cut this off right now. You could do that afterwards. Pick up your hackle pliers. Okay, grip the hackle by the tip, and what we're going to do, we're going to make one full turn at the shoulder. And once we've done that, we're very, very gently going to work our way down the body of the fly. Don't apply too much tension because you'll bust the hackle. Just make sure that all the fibers are flared nice and even as you come down. There we go, we get nearly to the tail end. Okay, this is not particularly difficult, but just watch exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up this ribbon tinsel and I'm going to bring it and make sure that it's to the right side of the hackle. Follow that? Now if you have the confidence to do it, which I do, as long as you maintain tension on that ribbon tinsel, you can remove your hackle pliers. Now, don't go through the laborious process of trying to weave it in and out of those hackle fibers as you go. If you want to get a good wind, you know what, get that ribbon tinsel and just whip that through there at 50 miles an hour. And if you do it, it'll spring all those hackle fibers out the way. If you deliberately try to wind that slow, I guarantee you, you'll trap them down. Okay, and then we got to the thread. Usual technique, right side, back up. As our security turns, we can break off the excessive stem. Cut that out. Make sure you don't catch the thread when you cut that out. And then we've got that powered hackle wind. Now there's one other option that you've got also. Some of the flies that we favor to use in a more traditional mode have two hackles. They have a body hackle wound and they have a head hackle in front of that. And again, that's generally tied in by the tip, and just for purposes of demonstration here, I'll use a partridge hackle. Find one of the right size that's going to work. Remember that if you don't get that set right in the first place, start again. And bring the thread forward to the eye of the hook, 3 or 4 tight wraps. And you should have that well secured. Okay, by the same technique as you use just to wind a single hackle, to make no difference whether what else is behind it, you're winding the hackle. Hold the hackle stem up, make sure that you've got all those fibers. Pull back to the rear. Don't attempt to wind the hackle until you did that. It's just really gently stroking them back, and under tension rotating the hackle to a point where you've got to release it to continue the wind. Just trap it with a finger on the far side. Come back up again and do exactly the same thing. Make sure you stroke all the fibers back to the rear. And really it's just a repetitive process to facilitate the amount of wind you want of the hackle. If you want it all wound, wind it all. If you only want 2 turns, wind 2 turns. Let's stand back to the scissors. That makes a nice clean cut. And then from that point onwards, we would build a whip finish ahead to the fly. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. I very much favour what I call double hackled. There's a little broken strand there. Double hackled palmed flies. They have a lot of value to them, you know, and you can orientate the body definition, the body hackle, and the head hackle, which could be whatever, dyed partridge, natural bird feather, whatever. But those flies work. They bounce in the surface film and do a lot of damage to the fish. There's one other hackle technique that's often used, and or in some cases partly used for a particular fly, and that's by definition what we call a throat hackle technique. And I'm going to show you the 2 techniques to apply that. Certain flies actually may have a palmed body hackle wound to them, but also a throat hackle of a different color combination tied in below. But pretty much the technique is the same, and when we actually get into tying some flies a little later, you'll see that because one of the flies incorporates that technique. But to all intents and purposes, throat hackles. There's 2 ways you do that. And we will assume we've got a body of the fly tied right there. And we finished up to that position there where we're going to tie in the hackle. Okay, the first one is this, is that you select from a hackle a whole big bunch of those fibers and collectively get them centered, and then very, very carefully just bring your fingers together and grip those very firmly. And then when you tear the stem away, you should have all of those fiber tips pretty much in alignment. nevertheless, what you're going to do is this. You're going to set those hackles fibers so that pretty much the extension of the hackle itself comes somewhere around about the point of the hook or just a little bit past. And you're going to lower those down on the hook shank like that and take a wrap of thread. What's important is you make sure that they are exactly on top of the shank of the hook. 2, 3 turns. And then what you can then do, see, normally I'd have a body against this, which would tend to keep the hackle pushed up against it and flare it some. But essentially all that you're essentially doing is this. You're producing a throat hackle below the fly by that method. The second method is this, and we'll take that out, is that you actually fully wind the hackle and then you flare it into a rearward inclination, and I'll show you how you do that. Whether you choose to tie the hackle in by the tip or the butt, it kind of has a relationship, I guess, to how the fibers of the hackle are. If you've got short fibers, I prefer to have those inside of the outside longer fibers. Other than that, just always prep the hackle as you previously did. That's just a matter of course. Cut off the stem or tip of the hackle, which is not needed. Catch that in underneath the shank of the hook, like that. Making 1, 2, 3 tight turns. And as you previously wound other hackles, hold the hackle up, draw the fibers rearward. 1, 2. Make sure you've got those straight back. 3, 4. Really depends how many turns you make, depending on what we define as the fullness of the hackle, what it is you're looking for on the finished fly. Hold the hackle stem up, bring the thread up, twist the hackle stem back. Oh, you can get it right there, lock it. 1, 2, 3. And you can cut off the excess. We're going to gently just stroke the hackle fibers down into a rearward inclination, and we're just going to reverse the thread back, and that will tend to keep the majority of those fibers down and below the shank of the hook. But pretty much what we've got is a down swept throat hackle definition to the fly.